That discomfort you feel when you read Luke chapter 2 and then Matthew chapter 2 side by side. That quiet sense that something does not fit. Spinoza named it. Two completely different stories. One of them placed Jesus somewhere that contradicts the other. And the church has hidden that for 2,000 years. I want to start with that discomfort. Not because it is unusual, but because I think most people who have read those two chapters carefully have felt it and then done what I did for most of my academic career. They set it aside. They trusted that someone, somewhere, had sorted it out. A scholar, a theologian, a commentary. Someone more expert than them had read the two accounts and found the harmony that they themselves could not quite see. What I want to tell you today is that the harmony was never there. And the reason I can say that with confidence is not because I discovered something new. It is because I eventually stopped setting it aside. I sat with the discomfort until I understood what it was actually telling me. And what it told me, what Spinoza told me, once I had worked through enough of his method to apply it here, changed how I read every single page of the New Testament that came after. My name is Malcolm. I taught theology and the philosophy of religion for most of my adult life, and I am still in my 7th decade, trying to undo the habits of thought that academic theology taught me in order to avoid looking at certain things directly. This is one of those things. And today, I'm going to look at it directly with you from the beginning. I want to take you through a journey. Not a quick argument, a journey. Because this is not something you can rush. The evidence needs to be laid out carefully, piece by piece, and the implications only become visible when you hold all the pieces at once. What Spinoza noticed about these two texts took me years to fully understand, and once I understood it, I could not teach Matthew or Luke the same way again. So, let us begin. The first time I encountered this problem properly, not as an abstract textual issue, but as a genuine crisis of comprehension, I was in my first year of doctoral work at Durham. Late autumn. The kind of afternoon in the north of England where the light turns the color of old paper by 3:30, and the reading carrels in the theology library are already lit by their small desk lamps, even though it is not yet evening. My supervisor had given me what he described as a simple task. Read Matthew chapters 1 and 2, then Luke chapters 1 and 2 in sequence. Make notes on where the accounts differ. It was not, he said, a theological exercise. It was a textual exercise. He wanted me to read the documents as documents, not as scripture, to look at what was actually on the page. I had read those chapters dozens of times. I had grown up with them. I knew them the way you know any text that was pressed into you early enough that it feels like memory rather than reading. I opened Matthew and moved through the genealogy, the Annunciation to Joseph, the birth in Bethlehem, the Magi, the flight to Egypt. Familiar ground, all of it. I turned to Luke, the Annunciation to Mary, the journey to Bethlehem for the census, the birth in the stable, the shepherds, the presentation in the temple, the return to Nazareth. I was perhaps 10 minutes into the exercise when I stopped. I went back to the beginning of Matthew. I read it again. I turned to Luke. I read that again. And what I was looking at was not a difference of emphasis, not a difference of theological focus or narrative selection, not one account choosing to include what the other chose to omit. What I was looking at was two accounts that disagreed about where the family of Jesus lived before he was born. In Matthew, there is no journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem. None. Joseph and Mary are already in Bethlehem. They live there. When the Magi arrive, they come to a house. Matthew specifically says, the house. After the flight to Egypt and the return, the family avoids returning to Judea because they are afraid of Herod's son Archelaus, who now rules there, and so they go north to Galilee, to Nazareth, for the first time. Nazareth, in Matthew's account, is not their home. It is their refuge from a political threat. In Luke, Joseph and Mary live in Nazareth. They have always lived in Nazareth. They travel to Bethlehem specifically, and only because of the census of Quirinius, the Roman registration that requires every man to register in his ancestral city. The baby is born in Bethlehem in a stable because there is no room in the inn. Shepherds come. And then, with no mention of Magi, no mention of Egypt, no mention of any flight, the family returns directly to Nazareth, which Luke explicitly calls their own city. I want you to hold both of those accounts in your mind at the same time, because that is the only way to see what Spinoza saw. These are not two versions of the same event. They are two accounts that begin from structurally incompatible premises about where this family's life was rooted. Matthew assumes Bethlehem as home, Nazareth is new. Luke assumes Nazareth as home, Bethlehem is temporary. They cannot both be right about this basic geographical fact. And this is where it gets interesting, because they are not describing the same journey. They are describing two entirely different lives. I closed both books. I sat for a long moment with the cold November light failing outside the carrel window. My tea, which I had poured 20 minutes earlier from a thermos, was already cold beside me. I had the specific sensation, not dramatic, not cinematic, just specific and quiet, of a man who has been trying to close a drawer and has suddenly noticed that there is something lodged in the back of it that has been preventing it from closing for years. I had been trying to harmonize those two accounts since I was old enough to read them. I had been doing it automatically, the way you accommodate the furniture in a room you know well, and now I had stopped accommodating. I picked up a pen and wrote at the top of the page, "Where does the family of Jesus live before the birth?" Matthew, Bethlehem. Luke, Nazareth. That was the problem. That was the whole problem. And no amount of careful theological reading was going to make it go away. But before I tell you what Spinoza makes of that problem, I need to show you something that makes the contradiction sharper still. Because the disagreement about geography is one thing, what follows from it chronologically is another matter entirely. Luke, as I mentioned, anchors the birth of Jesus to a specific historical event, the census of Quirinius. He is explicit about this. He says, and I am quoting the text directly, that in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered, and that this was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Quirinius, a specific named Roman official, a specific datable historical figure. And this is where three facts enter the conversation that cannot be made to fit together without doing violence to the text. The first is that Quirinius became governor of Syria in the year 6 of the Common Era. This is not contested. It is documented by the Roman historian Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, confirmed by an inscription found near Rome in the 19th century known as the Lapis Tiburtinus, and accepted by every serious classical historian who has examined the question. The second fact is that Herod the Great, the Herod who, in Matthew's account, learns of the birth from the Magi and orders the massacre of the infants in Bethlehem, died in the year 4 before the Common Era. This is also solidly documented. Josephus describes it. The date can be corroborated through records of a lunar eclipse that Josephus notes happened shortly before Herod's death, and astronomers have worked backward to pinpoint that eclipse to March of 4 before the Common Era. The third fact is that Matthew chapter 2 verse 1 states explicitly, "In the days of Herod the king." The birth of Jesus is placed under Herod. Now, Herod dies in 4 before the Common Era. Quirinius becomes governor of Syria in 6 of the Common Era. Between those two events, a gap of approximately 10 years. Two numbers, one interval. And the structure of both infancy narratives cannot survive it simultaneously. A scholar I respect enormously, a New Testament historian whose work I read in his early papers before he became widely known, once described this as a chronological impossibility that cannot be harmonized without misrepresenting what at least one of the texts is actually saying. I have thought about that phrasing many times since, without misrepresenting, because that is precisely what harmonization requires here, not reconciliation, misrepresentation. You cannot be born under Herod the Great and under the census of Quirinius. 10 years separate those two governors. No child straddles a decade. The two Gospels are not describing the same historical moment. What I'm about to show you about Micah and the prophetic requirement for Bethlehem will be difficult to put aside once you have seen it, because this is where the why becomes visible. Here is the question that Spinoza asks, and it is a question so simple that it is almost embarrassing once you hear it. Why does Jesus have to be born in Bethlehem? Not, why is he born there in the narratives? But, what is the external pressure, the prior requirement, that makes Bethlehem necessary in both accounts, despite the fact that every other piece of evidence in the New Testament places Jesus' home, his identity, his community, his disciples, his language, his trial, all of it in Galilee? The answer is a single verse from the Hebrew prophet Micah, Micah chapter 5 verse 2. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. Any Jewish reader of the first century knew this text. It was among the most cited prophecies in the messianic expectation of the Second Temple period. The Messiah would come from Bethlehem. This was not a marginal interpretation. This was the mainstream, the expectation, the test. If you wanted to claim messianic identity or to argue for the messianic identity of someone else, you had to account for Bethlehem. And the problem that both Matthew and Luke are, each in their own way, working to solve, is that Jesus was from Nazareth. All of Galilee knew it. His opponents knew it. In the Gospel of John, we have the explicit objection. Shall the Messiah come from Galilee? Has not the scripture said that the Messiah comes from the offspring of David and comes from Bethlehem, the village where David was? The person raising that objection is not making up the problem. The problem is real. Everyone in the first century knew where Jesus was from. Some scholars have described Matthew and Luke as theologians rather than historians, and by this, they mean something precise. They mean that the primary task of these writers was to demonstrate that Jesus fulfilled the messianic expectations of the Hebrew scriptures, not to record biographical information in the way that a modern historian would, to make the case, to prove, through the structure of the narrative, that the man who had gathered this community around him and who had died under Roman authority was the one the prophets had been pointing toward all along. That task requires Bethlehem. The prophecy demands it. You could argue that one of the two accounts might be historically accurate, that perhaps Matthew has the right geography, or perhaps Luke has the right geography, and only one of them is constructing a route to Bethlehem rather than recording a memory. Spinoza's response to that argument is the most precise thing I have ever read about how institutions protect convenient errors. His response is, it does not matter which one, if either is historically accurate. What matters is identifying the function the text is serving, and the function is the same in both accounts. Both Matthew and Luke need to get Jesus to Bethlehem. They have inherited a community that knows Jesus was from Nazareth, and they are writing for readers who know the Micah prophecy. They each solve the same theological problem by a different narrative route. Matthew makes Bethlehem the home and Nazareth the exile. Luke makes Nazareth the home and Bethlehem the destination of a journey. The problem being solved is identical. The solution is structurally parallel. What varies is the mechanics. I remember sitting with this for a long time. By the time I finished my doctorate and moved into lecturing, I was teaching the Synoptic Gospels regularly. And for years, I am embarrassed to admit how many years, I taught the infancy narratives with what I now recognize as a kind of managed evasion. I would note the differences between Matthew and Luke. I would invite students to see them as complementary perspectives. I would gesture toward the theological richness of both accounts without pausing too long over the geographical incompatibility at their core. I was not, I think, being dishonest in a calculated way. I was doing what my own teachers had done and what the tradition encouraged. I was treating the discomfort as a feature of the text's complexity, rather than as a signal that something needed to be examined more carefully. It was not until I was preparing a set of notes for a second-year synoptics class, this was some years after I had left Durham and was teaching at a seminary in the north of England, that the habit broke. I was writing up a comparison of the two infancy narratives for the students. I had decided to lay them out in parallel columns, the way textual scholars do, so that my students could see at a glance where the accounts aligned and where they diverged. I was sitting at my desk in the early evening, the brass lamp on, the window dark behind me, a half-drunk cup of tea at my elbow. I wrote Matthew 2, verse 11. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then I wrote Luke 2, verse 7. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and laid him in a manger. Then I moved forward. Matthew 2, verses 13 through 15. Immediately after the Magi depart, an angel appears to Joseph and tells him to flee to Egypt that night, because Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. They leave, they go to Egypt, they stay until Herod dies. I wrote that out. Then I turned to Luke 2, verses 22 through 39. 40 days after the birth, Mary and Joseph take the baby to Jerusalem for the purification ritual at the temple. They meet Simeon and Anna. They do everything required by the law. And then, verse 39, when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. Returned to Galilee, their own town. No Egypt, no flight in the night. No angel warning them of Herod's massacre. No massacre. No infants killed in Bethlehem. 40 days after the birth, in Luke's account, the family is performing a public religious ceremony in Jerusalem, in the heart of Herod's territory, without any apparent concern. I sat with that pen suspended above the page for what felt like quite a long time. How had I taught this side by side for years without writing it in columns? How had I helped students read these two texts and invited them to see them as complementary without sitting down and putting Matthew's Egypt and Luke's Jerusalem on the same line and asking myself which happened? Both are 40 days after the birth, approximately. Both cannot be true simultaneously. The lamp was burning, my tea was cold. The study around me was quiet in that particular way that a room gets quiet when you have been concentrating so hard that the world outside has stopped registering. And what I felt, and I want to be honest about what I felt, was not a breakthrough. It was not the relief of discovery. It was something closer to the loneliness of recognizing that I had been for years a participant in a habit of reading that was designed to not look at this, not to lie, not deliberately, but to not look. And in not looking, I had helped my students not look either. That is a different weight than finding an answer. That is the weight of being late to a question you should have asked sooner. By the time I finished that session and began actually restructuring my notes, I had arrived at the frame Spinoza had provided. Though I was working toward it from the inside rather than from his text, I want to explain that frame carefully because it is the key to everything that follows. Spinoza's central argument in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus is not that the biblical texts are false. His argument is more precise than that. He argues that before you can evaluate whether a text is true, you have to understand what function it is serving. What kind of writing is it? What was the writer trying to do? Who was the intended audience? And what did the writer need to persuade them of? Applied to the infancy narratives, this means asking, what were Matthew and Luke doing when they wrote their accounts of Jesus' birth? And the answer, which biblical scholars of considerable faith have reluctantly but honestly confirmed, is that they were doing theology. They were writing arguments. They were demonstrating for audiences who already believed in Jesus but needed to understand why he was the Messiah, that his life fulfilled the ancient prophecies. A scholar whose work I encountered in the British Library some years ago, a Jesuit priest, a man of deep and sincere faith, a rigorous academic who spent much of his career on the infancy narratives specifically, put it in terms I found more useful than most. He spent a considerable portion of his major work on this subject, laying out, item by item, the historical problems with both accounts. The census that cannot be dated to Herod's reign, the two incompatible geographies, the flight to Egypt that Luke knows nothing of, the temple presentation that Matthew leaves no room for. And his conclusion was not that the texts were worthless or false. His conclusion was that they were not written as birth certificates. They were written as theological arguments. And reading them as birth certificates, reading them as if their primary purpose was biographical accuracy, is a category error. It misunderstands the genre. Kaiser Vermes, another scholar whose work I have returned to repeatedly, said something in his study of the nativity narratives that stayed with me. He said the birth narratives are theological poems, not birth certificates. That formulation is compressed, but it is exact. Theological poems serve a different function than historical records. They carry truth of a different kind. The question is not whether they are true in the way that a census document is true. The question is what kind of truth they are telling. And here is the implication that the institutional church has consistently declined to discuss clearly. If the birth in Bethlehem is theological requirement rather than historical memory, if Matthew and Luke each independently constructed a route to Bethlehem because Micah 5, verse 2 demanded it, and their community knew Jesus was actually from Nazareth, then the geographical reality is Nazareth. By the time I finish showing you what every other source in the New Testament says, I will show you why every single document outside the infancy narratives calls him something that contradicts Bethlehem. Before I tell you what the title on the cross says, right there in the Gospel of John chapter 19, I need to walk you through the rest of the evidence because the argument is not built on one document. It is built on the convergence of every document. The most important detail in the entire discussion is one that most people have heard so many times that they have stopped hearing it. Jesus of Nazareth. Not Jesus of Bethlehem. Not Jesus the Bethlehemite. Every single gospel from the earliest to the latest uses the same identification. The Gospel of Mark, the oldest of the 4 canonical gospels, written before either Matthew or Luke, has no infancy narrative whatsoever. Mark begins with an adult Jesus in Galilee. He is not identified as a native of Bethlehem. He is identified by where he comes from, Nazareth. The opening miracle in the Capernaum synagogue leads a bystander to ask, "What is this?" The crowd identifies the man as Jesus of Nazareth. Throughout Mark, throughout Luke, throughout Matthew, throughout John, the consistent, repeated, unreflective identification is Nazareth. His followers are called Nazarenes. In the Acts of the Apostles, the early Christian community is described by its opponents as the sect of the Nazarenes, not the sect of the Bethlehemites, the Nazarenes. The identification is so consistent, so embedded, so assumed by every writer who touches this figure, that it reads as the kind of detail no one was trying to establish, because no one was disputing it. The opponents of Jesus in the Gospels use his Galilean origin as an argument against him. In the Gospel of John, the objection is explicit. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? The location is not a point of pride for the early community. It is a liability used by critics to cast doubt on the messianic claim. If Jesus had actually been born in Bethlehem, if that had been the living memory of the community rather than a theological argument about prophecy, it would have been the obvious response. He is from Bethlehem, the city of David. Instead, what we find is that his community did not dispute the Galilean identification. They answered it differently, through genealogy and prophecy, not through geography. And then there is the trial. In the Synoptic Gospels, when Peter is sitting in the courtyard of the high priest's house, the people around him identify him as an associate of the prisoner by his accent. "Your speech gives you away," someone says to him. "You are a Galilean, not a Judean, not from the region of Bethlehem, a Galilean." The accusation is built on regional identification, the particular quality of Galilean Aramaic that marked Peter and, by association, the man he followed. The responsibility of knowing the difference between a theological text and a historical document is not comfortable. Spinoza knew this. It cost him everything he had built within the community of his birth. He was excommunicated at the age of 23, in terms so harsh and final that they were never formally lifted. The institutions that hold these texts have a deep and understandable interest in not making the distinction he was making. But the distinction matters, and then the title on the cross, title on the E. In the Gospel of John chapter 19, verse 19, Pilate has an inscription fixed to the cross above Jesus' head. This is the titulus, the placard that Roman practice dictated should identify the condemned man and his crime. In John, the text reads, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." In the Latin abbreviation that has come down through Christian art and architecture, INRI. Jesus Nazarenus, Rex Judeorum. Jesus of Nazareth. Written by the Roman authority on the instrument of execution as the official identification of the man being killed. Even the state documentation Even the Roman record of the execution itself identifies him as the Nazarene. Not one external source, not one inscription from outside the infancy narratives, not one reference in Paul's letters which predate the Gospels, not one passage in the Acts of the Apostles, not one accusation by opponents, not one defense by followers, not one administrative Roman record. Nothing places the adult Jesus, the public figure, the teacher, the executed man, anywhere but Galilee, anywhere but Nazareth. The absence of Bethlehem from the documentary record of Jesus' public life is not the silence of lost documents. It is structural silence. It is the silence of a detail that the community never argued about because the community never believed it in that way. Bethlehem was prophecy being fulfilled. Nazareth was home. I've been sitting with all of this for many years now, long enough that the initial disorientation has settled into something more stable, not resolution exactly, but a kind of informed steadiness. And I want to tell you something honestly about what that steadiness feels like, because I think it matters. When I first understood what I have laid out for you today, really understood it, not as an abstract textual problem, but as the lived history of how a community shaped its founding documents to serve its needs, my first reaction was not intellectual triumph. It was a kind of grief, quiet and specific. Not the grief of losing faith, but the grief of losing a particular kind of innocence about what texts are and what they do. I had loved the infancy narratives. I had read Luke 2 on Christmas Eve in churches for years. There is a quality of prose in Luke's account, and she laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn, that I still find beautiful. I did not want to understand it as a theological argument. I wanted it to be a memory. But Spinoza taught me something that I think is ultimately more respectful of those texts than the harmonization I had been practicing. He taught me that asking what a document is doing is not the same as dismissing it. Understanding that Matthew and Luke were theologians, not biographers, that they were making arguments about who Jesus was in relation to the ancient prophecies rather than transcribing eyewitness accounts, does not diminish what they were trying to say. It clarifies it. It allows you to receive the theological argument on its own terms, instead of forcing it into a category of historical reporting that it was never designed to occupy. And it answers the question that the discomfort was always pointing toward. Jesus was born where the evidence places him, where all his friends, all his enemies, all the Gospels, all the documents, all the Roman records, and even the title on his cross place him. Galilee, a village called Nazareth, a place so unremarkable that the objection was literally, can anything good come from there? The Bethlehem narratives are not memories, they are arguments. Beautiful, historically layered, theologically precise arguments that say, this man from this provincial backwater was not an accident. He was the fulfillment of something ancient. He was what Micah was pointing toward. He was the one the prophecy named. That is what Matthew and Luke were telling their communities. That is what the text was doing. The question Spinoza leaves you with is this: now that you know the difference between the argument and the biography, how do you want to read the rest? I am not asking you to stop believing. I am asking you to know what you are believing. Because there is a faith that rests on the assumption that the infancy narratives are biographical reporting. And if that assumption is false, the faith cracks. And there is a faith that rests on something else. On the teachings, on the community, on the life as the Gospels collectively describe it. And for that faith, whether Jesus was born in a manger in Bethlehem or in a house in Nazareth, does not alter the central claim. Only you know which kind of faith you have. Only you know which question this video has just asked you. What I can tell you is that the discomfort you felt when you read those two chapters side by side was not a failure of comprehension. It was your intelligence working correctly. The text was showing you something real. Spinoza simply gave you the vocabulary to name what you saw. That is worth something, even when it is not comfortable. Take care of yourselves.